The auctioneer's voice was a rhythmic, hypnotic drone, a sound that meant death for one man's dream and the beginning of another's. It was late October 1975. A biting wind swept across the stubble of what used to be Frank Miller's North 80, carrying with it the smell of dying leaves and diesel exhaust. I stood at the back of the crowd, my hands buried deep in the pockets of my worn canvas jacket, the fabric stiff from years of grease and dirt. My name is Jedediah Stone, and I was there to bear witness. Frank was a good man, a hard worker, but he'd listened to the wrong people. He'd listened to the banker in town, Mr. Henderson, who preached the gospel of leverage and expansion. He'd bought a brand new John Deere 4630, a machine so big it looked like it belonged on a different planet compared to my old iron. He'd bought the latest 6-row planter and a self-propelled combine with a heated cab and a radio. He'd borrowed against the land his grandfather had homesteaded, all to chase the booming grain prices. And now, here we were. The bank was taking it all back. The crowd was a mix of neighbors, vultures, and the simply curious. They huddled together, sipping coffee from thermoses, their breath pluming in the cold air. But my eyes were fixed on one man, Richard Miller, Frank's own nephew. Richard, or Rich, as he insisted everyone call him, stood near the front, a smug grin plastered on his face. He was the new breed of farmer. He wore a clean seed corn cap, not a sweat-stained fedora. His boots weren't caked with mud and manure, they were polished. He farmed with a pen and a line of credit, not with calloused hands and a feel for the soil. And what am I bid for this prime 80 acres of Black Angus topsoil? The auctioneer chanted, his voice cutting through the wind. Land that's been in the Miller family for 3 generations. Do I hear $300 an acre? 300, 300. Can I get 300? A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. 300 was a fair price a few years ago. Now, with corn over $3 a bushel, it was a steal. 350, a voice called out. It was Rich. He didn't even look at the auctioneer, just kept his eyes on the land, like he already owned it. 350 I have, now 4. Can I get 400? Silence. A few men shuffled their feet. They knew who this auction was for. The bank had already made a deal with Rich. This was just a formality, a public execution to warn the rest of us what happens when you fall behind. I watched Frank standing by his pickup truck, his shoulders slumped, his face as grey as the November sky. His wife was inside the cab, her face hidden. I'd known him my whole life. We'd helped each other put up hay, fixed fences together. To see him broken like this, it stirred something cold and hard in my gut. Sold. To Mr. Richard Miller for $350 an acre. The auctioneer's gavel fell with a sharp crack that sounded like a breaking bone. A smattering of polite applause broke out. Rich turned and surveyed the crowd, his eyes landing on me. He strode over, his new boots crunching on the corn stubble. "Jed," he said, his voice slick with false sympathy, "a damn shame, isn't it? Uncle Frank just couldn't keep up." I didn't say anything, I just stared at him, my jaw set. "You know, Jed," he continued, gesturing toward my old Ford F100 parked on the road, its paint faded and a patch of Bondo on the fender. "The bank's offering some real aggressive financing right now. You could trade in that old 4020 of yours, get into a new 1066. Hell, get yourself a cab with AC. It's a new world. You can't farm 1,000 acres with a 60-horse tractor anymore." My John Deere 4020 wasn't a 60-horse tractor, it was 95, and he knew it. It was a 1968, the last of the good ones before they started adding all the complicated electronics. I'd bought it with cash 5 years ago after a string of good harvests, and it hadn't cost me a dime in interest since. It was mine. Every bolt, every tire, every grease fitting. "My 4020's paid for, Rich," I said, my voice low and even. "So is my land. I sleep pretty good at night." He chuckled, a short, dismissive sound. "You're sleeping all right, sleeping while the rest of us are making money. This is the 70s, old man. You gotta use debt. It's a tool, just like a plow. Uncle Frank's mistake wasn't borrowing. It was not borrowing enough to get big enough, fast enough." He clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture that was meant to be friendly but felt like a shove. "You think about it. Henderson over at the bank would love to see you. Don't end up like Frank." He walked away then, joining the circle of men who were congratulating him, slapping his back. They were the new farmers, the ones who talked about cash flow and depreciation schedules more than they talked about rainfall and soil types. I watched them, and then I looked over at Frank, a ghost on his own land. And I knew Rich was wrong. Frank's mistake wasn't that he didn't borrow enough. It was that he'd borrowed at all. He'd traded a deed for a dream, and the dream had turned into a nightmare. I turned and walked back to my truck. The door creaked open with a familiar groan. The cab smelled of oil and old vinyl. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. The lines on my face were getting deeper, etched by sun and worry. I wasn't an old man, not yet. But in their world, the world of shiny new iron and easy credit, I was a dinosaur. A relic. Before I go on and tell you how this all played out, how a pile of scrap iron from a junkyard ended up in the middle of this fight, I have to ask you folks listening to this, have you ever known a man like me? A man who stuck to his guns, who believed in the old ways, even when the whole world was screaming at him that he was a fool? Maybe it was your father or your grandfather. Let me know down in the comments, because it's important to remember that men like that existed. They were the bedrock. The drive home was quiet. The two-lane blacktop wound through the rolling hills of southern Iowa. The fields were all picked clean, the land resting for the winter. But I wasn't resting. Rich's words echoed in my head. Was I a fool? My wife, Sarah, worried. She saw the new kitchen appliances the other farm wives had. She saw them driving new station wagons into town. She never said a word, but I could see it in her eyes. The fear that I was letting pride get in the way of progress. My own operation was small, but it was solid. 320 acres, free and clear. The house my grandfather built, the barn my father raised, and my iron, my beautiful, simple, paid-for iron. The John Deere 4020 Synchro range was my main horse. I knew every inch of that machine. I knew the specific whine the hydraulics made when the oil was cold. I knew the exact spot on the throttle to set it for the perfect PTO speed. Alongside it was the old Farmall M, a 1949 model that still started on the second crank every time. It was my utility tractor, used for raking hay and running the grain auger. It sipped gasoline like a fine whiskey and never complained. My biggest liability was my combine, a Massey Ferguson 35 pull type. It was old when I bought it 10 years ago, a relic even then. It was a simple machine, but harvest was always a nerve-wracking affair. Every clank, every groan from its guts sent a spike of fear through me. A major breakdown during those critical 2 weeks of October could ruin me. And this past harvest, it had given me a real scare. The main drive chain had snapped, whipping around and cracking the cast iron housing for the primary gearbox. I'd spent 2 days with the torch and the arc welder, stitching that housing back together, reinforcing it with a piece of 1/4-inch plate steel. The whole time, Rich Miller had driven by in his brand-new Gleaner L2, its silver paint gleaming in the sun. He'd slowed down, leaned out of his air-conditioned cab, and just shook his head with a pitying smirk. The message was clear. Look at the fossil, trying to hold the world together with bubblegum and baling wire. That winter, the talk at the co-op was all about expansion. Grain prices were holding steady, and land values were skyrocketing. Men who'd paid $200 an acre 5 years ago were seeing their net worth double and triple on paper. The bank was handing out money like it was candy at a parade. Rich Miller bought another quarter section, the one bordering my land to the west. He'd come over one afternoon, leaning against my fence. "Jed, I'll give you a fair price for this 80 of yours," he'd said, hooking a thumb toward my best field. 800 an acre. Cash. You could pay off that old Massey combine, maybe take the wife on a real vacation. "It's not for sale, Rich. Everything's for sale for the right price," he'd countered. "You're farming like it's 1950. You can't make a living on a half section anymore. The game has changed." "Maybe you're playing a different game than I am," I'd told him, turning my back and walking toward my workshop. The game I was playing was called Survival. The game he was playing was called Monopoly, and he didn't seem to realize the bank always wins in the end. The next spring, the true struggle began. It started with the little things. The price of diesel fuel jumped 15 cents a gallon. The cost of fertilizer was up 30%. The parts I needed for my old equipment were getting harder to find. The local dealership didn't stock them anymore. They wanted to sell you new machines, not help you keep the old ones running. I spent more and more time driving to junkyards, routing through rows of rusting hulks, looking for a usable water pump or a specific gear. My workshop became my sanctuary. The smell of penetrating oil and hot metal was my incense. I had a heavy-duty drill press, a Lincoln arc welder, and a lathe my father had bought after the war. With those 3 tools, I could make or fix just about anything. I learned to rebuild my own generators, re-sleeve hydraulic cylinders, and patch cracked engine blocks. Each repair was a small victory, a middle finger to the throwaway world Rich Miller and the bank were building. But it was a lonely fight. At church on Sundays, the other men would talk about their new 4-wheel drive tractors, their plans to build new grain bins with government-subsidized loans. When they asked what I was up to, and I told them I'd just finished rebuilding the carburetor on my farm, they'd look at me with a mixture of pity and contempt. I was the town eccentric, the man who was too stubborn or too poor to join the party. The breaking point came that fall during soybean harvest. The Massey 35 had been groaning and complaining for a week. I'd been nursing it along, tightening belts, greasing bearings every 2 hours. I was halfway through my last field, the one right along the road, when it happened. There was a loud bang, a screech of tortured metal, and then a sickening, grinding silence. The whole machine shuddered to a stop. I climbed down from the tractor seat, my heart sinking into my boots. A cloud of oily smoke was pouring out of the side of the combine. I pulled open the access panel. It was a catastrophe. The main cylinder shaft had sheared clean in 2. It had flailed around inside the machine like a broken bone, destroying the cylinder bars, bending the concave, and punching a fist-sized hole in the side of the combine's body. It wasn't a repair. It was an autopsy. I just stood there, my hands on my hips, staring at the mechanical carnage. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the field. I had 40 acres of soybeans left, and a storm was forecast for the day after tomorrow. I was ruined. As if on cue, I heard the roar of a big diesel engine. Rich Miller pulled up on the road in his shiny new pickup. He got out and walked over to the fence, a look of theatrical concern on his face. "Trouble, Jed," he called out. I didn't answer. I just kicked one of the combine's tires, the rubber worn smooth and cracked with age. "Looks like the old girl finally gave up the ghost," he said, leaning on a fence post. "Told you that thing belonged in a museum. Look, I'm done with my beans. I could bring my gleaner over in the morning, finish this up for you. For a price, of course. Say 20% of the crop." 20%? That was my entire profit margin. It was highway robbery. He knew I was in a bind, and he was squeezing me. "No thanks," I said through gritted teeth. "I'll figure it out." He laughed out loud. "Figure it out? With what? A bucket and a scoop shovel? Don't be a fool, Jed. Your pride isn't going to get those beans out of the field before the rain hits. Just call me when you come to your senses." He got back in his truck and drove off, leaving me alone with the silence and the wreck of my combine. The wind rustled the dry soybean leaves. It sounded like they were laughing at me. For the first time, I felt a flicker of doubt. Maybe they were all right. Maybe I was just a stubborn old fool, clinging to a past that was gone forever. Maybe it was time to give up, walk into the bank with my hat in my hand, and sign my life away for a new machine. I sat down on the tractor hitch, put my head in my hands, and felt the cold dread of failure wash over me. The next few years were a blur of prosperity for everyone but me. It was the great farm boom of the mid-1970s. Russia was buying American grain by the boatload, and prices shot into the stratosphere. Corn hit $4 a bushel, soybeans went to 10. Land that Rich had paid $350 for was now worth over $1,000. Men who had been simple farmers were suddenly millionaires on paper. The change was everywhere. New pickups roared down the gravel roads. New houses, big split levels with 2-car garages, sprang up where modest farmhouses once stood. The dealership in town built a massive new showroom, its huge plate glass windows filled with gleaming green and red tractors, machines that cost more than my entire farm was worth just a decade earlier. The prevailing wisdom, preached from the bank to the coffee shop, was singular: expand. Get bigger or get out. Debt wasn't a risk, it was an opportunity. Inflation would make the loans cheaper to pay back tomorrow, so borrow as much as you could today. Rich Miller was the poster boy for the new era. He bought another 200 acres, bringing his total to well over 1,000. He traded in his 2-year-old International 1066 for a brand new 1466, a monster of a tractor with dual rear wheels, a turbocharger that screamed like a jet engine, and a cab so quiet you could listen to the radio while you plowed. He built a new Morton machine shed, a steel palace big enough to park a fleet of semis in. He and his wife took a winter vacation to Hawaii. He was the king of the county, the man who had seen the future and mortgaged it. And me? I was the village idiot. That fall after the Massey had died, I hadn't gone to the bank. I hadn't called Rich. I'd spent a sleepless night staring at the ceiling, and the next morning I'd driven my old Ford truck 60 miles to a massive farm equipment salvage yard on the other side of the state. I spent 2 days walking through acres of mechanical skeletons, my boots sinking into the greasy mud. I was looking for a miracle, and I found it, half buried behind a row of rusted-out corn pickers. It was a behemoth, a John Deere 95, one of the first self-propelled combines Deere ever made. It was from the late 1950s, a round-backed, clumsy-looking giant. The green paint was almost completely gone, replaced by a uniform coat of orange rust. The tires were flat and cracked. Birds had built a nest in the engine compartment. The owner of the yard laughed when I asked about it. That old thing? Been sitting there for 15 years. Engines probably seized solid. I'll give it to you for scrap price, $500. You haul it. I spent an hour crawling all over it. It was a mess, but it was simple. There were no complex hydraulics, no electronics. It was all belts, chains, and gears. The engine, a big gasoline 6-cylinder, turned over when I put a wrench on the crankshaft pulley. The frame was solid. It was a project, a massive back-breaking project, but it was possible. I paid the man his $500. Getting it home was an ordeal in itself. It took a whole day with a neighbor's lowboy trailer, 2 tractors, and a lot of swearing. We dragged it into my machine shed, where it sat like a wounded whale, leaking rust and dirt onto the concrete floor. The town thought I had finally lost my mind. The story of Jed Stone and his junkyard combine became the joke of the fall. Rich Miller would drive by my place, slow down, and point it out to whoever was riding with him, and they would both have a good laugh. But while they were laughing, I was working. Every night that winter, after chores were done, I was in the shop. I pulled the engine and completely rebuilt it, grinding the valves, putting in new rings and bearings. I took every single chain off, soaked it in diesel fuel, and replaced the stiff links. I replaced over 2 dozen bearings, pounding the old ones out and pressing the new ones in. I had to fabricate a new set of cylinder bars on my lathe. I rewired the entire machine from front to back. Sarah would bring me out a hot meal around 9 o'clock, her face etched with a mixture of love and deep concern. "Jed, are you sure about this?" she'd ask quietly. "It's good iron, Sarah," I'd reply, my hands black with grease. "It just needs some attention." While Rich was leveraging his paper wealth to buy more land and bigger toys, I was using the profits from the high grain prices to become truly debt-free. I made the final payment on our 320 acres. I paid off the small note on my truck. I took a chunk of cash and bought a dozen head of Angus heifers. The rest I put in a simple savings account at the bank, earning a pathetic 3% interest. Mr. Henderson, the banker, called me into his office. "Jed," he said, leaning back in his big leather chair, a picture of paternal disappointment. "You have over $20,000 just sitting here, losing value to inflation every day. Inflation is running at 7%. You're losing money. Let's put that money to work. We can use it as a down payment on that quarter section next to you. At today's land prices, you'll make that back in 2 years, easy." "I like knowing the money's there, Mr. Henderson," I said. "But it's not working for you. It's lazy money," he insisted. "Rich Miller understands. He's not afraid to use the bank's money to make his own fortune." "Rich Miller also owes you over $500,000, I said quietly. "I owe you nothing. I think I'll keep my money lazy if it's all the same to you." I walked out of the bank feeling like a man from another century. The whole world was drunk on debt and easy money, and I was the only sober one at the party. It was a lonely feeling. I was seen as a failure, a man too timid to grab his share of the boom. My net worth was a fraction of Rich's. He had gleaming steel and thousands of acres. I had a rusty old combine, a small herd of cows, and a passbook savings account. By the spring of 1978, the Junkyard combine was ready. I'd painted it myself, a fresh coat of John Deere green with yellow wheels. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I fired up the big 6-cylinder engine. It coughed to life in a cloud of blue smoke, then settled into a low, powerful rumble. The sound was music to my ears. That fall, I harvested my corn and soybeans with the old John Deere 95. It was slow, it was loud, it had no cab, and I ate a pound of dust every day. But it worked. It threshed the grain clean and put it in the hopper. And at the end of every day when I shut it down, I knew that if something broke, I could fix it with my own 2 hands. I wasn't beholden to a dealership's service department or a bank loan. The boom rolled on. Land prices hit $2,000 an acre. But a few dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, clouds that only a man who wasn't blinded by the glare of new money could see. The price of fuel oil for drying our corn doubled. I heard a man on the radio, a fellow named Paul Volcker from the Federal Reserve, talking about inflation being a cancer on the economy. He talked about using interest rates as a form of chemotherapy. At the co-op, the old-timers were starting to whisper. They'd seen this before, after the First War. A big boom, followed by a devastating bust. But no one was listening. The music was still playing, and everyone was still dancing. They just couldn't hear that it was starting to slow down. The summer of 1980 arrived on a blast of hot, dry air that felt like it came straight from a furnace. The sky turned a pale, hazy blue and stayed that way for weeks. The corn, which had come up so strong and green in the spring, stopped growing. By July, the leaves were curling up during the day, a desperate, thirsty gesture. The ponds on my land shrank, their edges turning into cracked mud flats, where the raccoons left perfect hand-like prints. The old-timers at the co-op stopped talking about grain prices and started remembering the Dust Bowl. Rich Miller's operation, so impressive from a distance, began to show the strain. Farming 1,000 acres takes a lot of water, and he didn't have it. His center-pivot irrigation systems, which he'd installed on a massive government loan, ran day and night, but they were just a mist against the relentless sun. His power bills must have been astronomical. He looked thin and frayed. The smug confidence was gone, replaced by a permanent, anxious squint. One afternoon, I was out checking the fence line between my property and the old Frank Miller place that Rich now farmed. The air was still and heavy. The only sound was the clicking of grasshoppers. Then I heard it, a high-pitched metallic scream, followed by a series of loud, clattering pops and a sudden choked silence. It came from the direction of Rich's farmstead. I climbed the fence and walked toward the sound. I found him standing in the middle of his field, next to his enormous International 1466. A plume of greasy black smoke curled from the exhaust pipe, hanging in the dead air. The big tractor was hitched to a 24-foot field cultivator, but it wasn't moving. Rich had the side panel of the engine cowling open and was just staring into it, his hands on his hips, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. "What's the trouble?" I asked, keeping my voice even. He didn't look at me. "Turbo's shot," he bit out. "Impeller must have disintegrated, probably sent shrapnel through the whole damn engine." I looked past his shoulder. It was a mess. The compressor housing was cracked, and a film of black engine oil was sprayed all over the hot manifold. He was right. That engine was likely ruined. A complete rebuild, if it was even possible. "Called the dealership," he said, kicking a huge rear tire that was taller than I was. "They can't even look at it for 2 weeks. Got a half-dozen other guys ahead of me, said a new turbo assembly is $3,000 if they can find one, and that's before they even talk about the engine damage." He finally turned to look at me, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and stress. "This is the only tillage tractor I've got that can pull this damn cultivator. I've got to get my bean stubble worked before it gets any harder than a brick. Every day I wait is yield I'm losing for next year." I just nodded. I didn't say a word about my old 4020 sitting in my shed, paid for and ready to go. I didn't need to. The silence said it all. His state-of-the-art 150 horsepower machine was a useless lump of steel because of one complex, expensive part he couldn't fix and couldn't get. It was a fragile link in a very long and expensive chain. The cracks in his empire started to widen. That summer, the news on the radio became my constant companion as I worked. President Carter had embargoed grain sales to the Soviet Union. Just like that, our biggest customer was gone. The bottom fell out of the market. Corn that had been $4 a bushel was suddenly worth $2.25. Soybeans plummeted. At the same time, that man Volcker at the Federal Reserve declared war on inflation. The prime interest rate, the number that governed all the other loan rates, started to climb like a runaway freight train. 10%, 12, 15. The loans that men like Rich had taken out were mostly variable rate. It was a detail the bankers had glossed over during the good times. Now it was a hangman's noose. The payments on his land and machinery doubled, then tripled. At the exact same moment, the income he needed to make those payments was cut in half. I saw the first real sign of his desperation in the fall. He sold off his entire herd of beef cattle, the ones he'd bought just a few years earlier. He didn't sell them at the big livestock auction in town. He sold them privately, quickly. He needed cash, and he needed it fast. He was selling off the seed corn to save the harvest. That harvest was a grim affair across the county. The drought had cut yields by a third. My old John Deere 95 combine rumbled through my fields, slow and steady. It broke down twice. A clogged fuel line one day, a slipped belt the next. Both times I had it fixed and running again in under an hour with tools from my own toolbox. I saw Rich's massive Gleaner L2 sitting idle for 3 straight days, waiting on a hydraulic valve to be shipped from a warehouse in Illinois. 3 good, dry days, lost forever. By the winter of 1981, the mood in our small community had turned dark. The easy optimism of the 70s was gone, replaced by a quiet, gnawing fear. The word foreclosure started to be whispered again, a word that hadn't been heard much since the 30s. The music had stopped, and everyone was scrambling for a chair that was no longer there. The collapse didn't happen all at once. It was a slow, grinding process, like a disease. It started with letters from the bank, their tone shifting from friendly reminders to stark, legal demands. Then came the phone calls from Mr. Henderson, his voice no longer smooth and reassuring, but hard and impatient. The bank was in trouble too. They had loaned out millions against land that was now worth less than half of what they'd valued it at. They were desperate. The auctions began the following spring. It was a plague of them. Every Saturday, another farm family saw their lives sold off piece by piece on their own front lawn. These weren't like Frank Miller's auction. There was no sense of opportunity, no vultures circling for a good deal. There was just a profound collective sadness. The men bidding were grim-faced neighbors, trying to buy back a friend's favorite tractor to give it back to him, or simply bearing witness to the wreckage. The prices were pitiful. A 4-wheel drive tractor that had cost $100,000 3 years before now sold for $20,000. Rich Miller held on longer than most. He was a fighter, I'll give him that. He sold off parcels of land, trying to pay down the interest on his loans, but it was like trying to bail out the Titanic with a teaspoon. The land market was dead. He was selling into a vacuum, taking ruinous losses. Every sale just made the bank re-evaluate the collateral on his remaining land, and they'd declare him further underwater. It was a death spiral. I saw him one day in town, coming out of the hardware store. He looked like a ghost. He'd lost weight, and his eyes had the haunted look of a man who hadn't slept in months. He was driving an old, beat-up Chevy Elove pickup, not the shiny new Ford he used to have. He saw me, and for a moment I thought he was going to turn away. But he didn't. He just stopped and stared at me, his shoulders slumped. "You were right, Jed," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "God help me, you were right all along." I didn't know what to say. There was no triumph in it. Seeing him broken didn't bring me any satisfaction. It was just a tragedy. "I'm sorry, Rich," I said, and I meant it. "The bank's taking it all," he said, his eyes welling up. "Everything. The auction is in 2 weeks." I survived because my world was small and my foundations were deep. The interest rate hikes that were killing my neighbors meant nothing to me. I had no loans. The low grain prices hurt, but my costs were a fraction of theirs. I didn't have a $5,000 a month payment to the bank. I grew a huge garden, and Sarah canned enough vegetables to last us through the year. My small herd of Angus cattle, which I'd bought with cash, provided a steady stream of income from calf sales that paid for our groceries and property taxes. My old simple machines kept running. My workshop was my fortress. While the modern world of finance and technology was collapsing around us, my little island of 1950s self-sufficiency remained solid. The money in my savings account, the lazy money Mr. Henderson had mocked, was now my ironclad guarantee of survival. It wasn't making me rich, but it was letting us sleep at night. And in 1982, in rural Iowa, a good night's sleep was a priceless commodity. The day of Rich Miller's auction was cold and grey, almost identical to the day of his uncle's sale years before. But the mood was entirely different. The crowd was bigger, but it was somber, funereal. It felt like the whole county was there to mourn. They weren't just selling off Rich's land and equipment, they were burying an era. The dream of get bigger or get out had died, and this was its wake. I stood at the back again, just as I had before. My savings passbook was tucked into the inside pocket of my coat. It represented years of careful living, of going without, of fixing instead of buying. Rich was standing with his wife and kids near the farmhouse, looking hollowed out. Mr. Henderson was there, looking stressed and older, his face grim. He wasn't a predator today. He was just a functionary of a system that was consuming them all. They sold off the equipment first, the massive International 1466, its engine hastily patched back together, sold for a quarter of what he owed on it. The gleaming Gleaner combine went for even less. It was a bloodbath. Then the auctioneer turned to the land. He started with the parcels Rich had bought last, the most expensive and heavily mortgaged ones. They sold for pennies on the dollar. Finally, he got to the last piece. And now, folks, the auctioneer's voice cracked a little. He knew this land. He knew its story. We have the Home 80, the original Miller homestead. 80 acres of the finest soil in this county. What am I bid? Silence. The wind whistled around the corner of the barn. This was the land Rich had bought from his own uncle. The land that had started his whole empire. It felt cursed. Let's start the bidding at $400 an acre, the auctioneer pleaded. 400. Can I get 400? More silence. The bankers were sweating now. They needed to get something, anything. From the back of the crowd, my voice came out clear and steady. $400. A ripple went through the crowd. Heads turned. Rich looked up, his eyes locking with mine. His expression was a mixture of shock and confusion. I have 400 from Jed Stone. Now 4.25. Can I get 425? Mr. Henderson, on behalf of the bank, bid 410. He was trying to protect his investment, to push the price up. 450, I said without hesitating. The crowd murmured. They knew my reputation. They knew I didn't deal in debt. If I was bidding, it was with cash. Henderson looked flustered. He conferred with another man in a suit. He couldn't bid against himself forever. They needed a real buyer. 460, Henderson said, his voice tight. 500, I said. My voice didn't waver. That was my number. It was a fair price, a price the land could actually support with the crops it grew, not some inflated figure on a banker's ledger. It was almost all the money I had in the world. The auctioneer looked at Henderson. I have $500 an acre. Do I hear 510? Henderson shook his head, a slight defeated gesture. It was over. Sold. The gavel cracked. To Jedediah Stone for $500 an acre. I didn't feel a rush of victory. I just felt the weight of the moment. I had bought back Frank Miller's land. I walked through the parting crowd toward the auctioneer's table to sign the papers. As I did, I passed Rich. He just stood there, his family huddled around him, looking at me as if I were a ghost. I finished with the clerk and walked over to him. He wouldn't meet my eye. He was a proud man, and this was the ultimate humiliation. Rich, I said quietly. He finally looked up. You came to gloat? To say you told me so? No, I said. I came to make you an offer. That's Miller land. It has been for almost 100 years. It's not right that my name is on the deed. He looked confused. What are you talking about? I'm talking about this, I said. I'll lease it back to you for $1 a year. You farm it. You and your family can stay in the house. We'll work out a fair crop share agreement on the rest of your old place if the new owners are willing. You're a good farmer, Rich. You just listened to the wrong people. You know this soil better than anyone." He stared at me, his mouth half open. His wife started to cry softly. "Why?" he choked out. "After everything? Why would you do that?" "Because this isn't about being right," I said, looking from him to the land and then back again. "It's about surviving, and nobody survives alone out here. We're neighbors. That's got to mean something." Word of what happened at the auction spread through the county like wildfire. It changed things. The other farmers, the ones who had dismissed me as a relic, started looking at me differently. They started stopping by my workshop. At first it was just to ask if I had a spare part for an old tractor they'd dragged out of the weeds, trying to save money. Then they started asking for advice. My shop, my sanctuary of self-reliance, became a place of community resilience. We'd spend evenings helping a neighbor rebuild a transmission, sharing knowledge, trading parts, and keeping each other's old iron running. We were holding our world together with baling wire and fellowship, and it was stronger than any bank loan. The years rolled on. The 1980s were hard, but we made it through. Rich took my offer. It was a long, slow climb back for him, but he worked that 80 acres with a reverence I'd never seen in him before. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet humility. He became a better farmer and a better man. He eventually bought the land back from me, not at the market price, but for exactly what I had paid for it, plus 3% interest, what my money would have earned sitting in the bank. It was the only deal I would accept. I'm an old man now. My hands are gnarled and stiff, but they can still tell when a bearing is seated just right. My son, Daniel, runs the farm, but he does it my way. He understands the difference between assets and cash, between wealth and worth. We have a new tractor in the shed, a John Deere from the late 80s, but it's sitting right next to the 4020, and Daniel knows how to work on both. The old Junkyard combine, the John Deere 95, is retired. It sits in the back of the machine shed, covered in a dusty tarp, a monument to a lesson hard learned. Sometimes my grandson, a boy of 10 with my wife's eyes, comes out to the workshop. I'll be tinkering with the old Farmall M, grinding its valves or setting the timing. He'll watch me, his face full of questions. The other day he asked me, "Grandpa, why do you work on this old tractor? Wouldn't it be easier to just buy a new one?" I wiped my greasy hands on a red rag and looked at him. I pointed to the tractor. "You see this machine?" I said. "It doesn't have a computer, it doesn't have a fancy radio, but everything on it I can understand. I can take it apart and I can put it back together. It's honest. It was built to last, not to be replaced." I leaned in closer. "Everybody will try to sell you something new. They'll tell you that you need to borrow money to get ahead. They'll call debt a tool. But you remember this, a tool can build a house or it can tear one down. It all depends on whose hand is holding it. The most important thing you'll ever own is your own name, free and clear. Don't ever trade it for a loan." He nodded, not fully understanding, but filing it away. I knew one day he would. I turned back to the old tractor, the smell of gasoline and oil filling the air. Outside, the sun was setting over the Iowa fields. The land was quiet, resting. My land. And Frank Miller's land. Safe. I looked out over the rows of corn, stretching to the horizon, and I felt a deep, abiding peace. It wasn't the thrill of victory or the satisfaction of being right. It was the quiet, sturdy contentment of a man who had held on, who had kept the faith in the old ways, and who had saved not just his farm, but a piece of its soul.